Thank you, Eileen. Okay, so I don't usually break professional demeanor and giggle when I'm at the table full of speakers, but when there was a loud crash behind us, Robin whispered that was Valiant's market share. So let the ripping begin. Okay, so a number of previous speakers have already touched on the topic of orphan and rare diseases. Certainly John did a great job of speaking to his segment of the orphan disease market fairly accurately. We've also talked at length about pricing constraints and pricing restrictions within pharma. What I'd like to do is offer my spin on and my interpretation of the orphan and rare disease market. What is traditionally seen as an orphan disease within the construct of United States FDA regulations governing orphan diseases doesn't necessarily answer all of the questions and address all of the issues that exist and are emerging within the area of rare diseases. So we're going to be talking about, after I make a shot about the head of Turing Pharmaceuticals, because I want one too. We're going to be talking about how the ground beneath our feet from both a diagnostics and scientific perspective is shifting, and a reinterpretation of rare diseases, I think, is necessary. But first, we will have a question. True or false, I work in an organization that has at least one product for a rare or orphan disease in its portfolio. Okay, interesting. About a third of us who own drug assets are playing in the orphan or rare disease space. I would argue that that's going to increase significantly. But first, a public service announcement, and that is parents. Who here are parents? Show of hands. Okay, parents, please don't buy your kids a hedge fund. Okay. Because they're going to buy a pharmaceutical product and they're going to get on Twitter and they're going to piss off only the entire world. And Mark, it's not fair that you hang this on Hillary, man. She's just one part of this equation because Donald got on Twitter and he agreed with Hillary, and I think that is one of the coming signs of the pharma apocalypse, quite frankly, when Donald and Hillary agree about anything. And so other than immensely amusing and immensely concerning and being a case study in just crappy corporate communications skills, why is this germane? Well, because what this issue is doing is it's moving the debate around the price of medications in the wrong direction. Non-innovative players who are raising this kind of hullabaloo in the market are moving pressures, exerting pressures on price in the wrong directions and making it difficult from innovative players to develop and launch medications for rare or orphan diseases and actually have any expectation of recouping those costs. So this is the scenario, this is the environment we find ourselves in developing medications for rare diseases. So let's talk a little bit about what exactly are rare diseases. As was already stated, a disease is orphaned, rather, if the science exists to come up with a cure, but there's no economic impetus to develop and market that cure. There is a different economic logic in place for medicines for rare diseases. There is a fixed and very high cost to the development of these medications, but there is a relatively small number of patients across which to distribute these high costs. And so the perception is that the cost per patient for rare diseases research is extremely high. Well, society has signaled very clearly that it wishes for us to do research in rare and orphan diseases and come up with cures for rare or orphan diseases. The United States has legislation in place since 1983. Japan, Australia, and now the European Union have legislation in place that facilitate research activities by pharmaceutical companies and incent research and development by pharmaceutical companies. And so, the paradigm still sticks. It's still standard. You examine a disease, you come up with a target, you identify a medication, you develop it, you convince regulators, you convince payers, you convince the healthcare community of the value of your medication, and then at the end of that chain, hopefully, some poor schmuck with a very rare and debilitating and life-threatening disease can benefit from that medication. Well, we're going to focus on a couple of facets of that regulatory funding development cycle. I want to zoom in on considerations for development. I want to focus on considerations for actually getting somebody to not just approve, but to pay for this medication. And how do we actually engage patients who feel isolated, who feel underserviced by the medical community, who feel disunited, disintegrated from society, who feel very much cast adrift. And so we've talked about what a rare disease is, and it's been mentioned before how Canada doesn't actually have robust legislation or any regulation, rather, facilitating the development of medications for rare diseases. But basically, rare diseases fit into one of two categories, and this is according to me. On the one hand, you can have a monogenic hereditary rare or orphan disease, and that is a disease that's identifiable within your genome, that is usually transmissible from parent to offspring, and that happen very infrequently. And so this here is a snapshot of me, courtesy of 23andMe. According to 23andMe, for the low cost of $119 plus tax and shipping, I now know that I don't have the genetic variant for limb-girdle muscular dystrophy or phenylketonuria, but we know these things because I'm alive, quite frankly. What they've done is genetically determine I don't carry the marker for this group of rare orphan diseases. And this, I would argue, John, is where your PNH and your hypophosphatemia falls, is in this family of rare genetically transmissible diseases. There is a whole nother family of rare diseases that we are going to be encountering, and those are rare diseases that we previously did not recognize because they were indistinguishable from other more common diseases. And so recently I was chatting with my 93-year-old grandmother, and she's actually quite lucid about family things. We're trying to get our handle on ancestry. And we were discussing one of her relatives, and she said he died of the cancer. And I said, he died of the cancer. Okay, the cancer. I'm unfamiliar with that disease. What cancer did he have? And she said, yeah, the doctors opened him up, and it was all through him. There was nothing they can do. He died. And so this is about a circa 1900s, 1910 understanding of the disease cancer. We now know, in about 1970, we found out that cancers come in different organs. They come with different cell types. So within the last decade and a half, we realized that cancers are actually made up of families, clusters of genetic mutations. And so what we typically referred to as lung cancer, or we typically refer to as non-small cell lung cancer, is not a disease. It is a family, a grouping of genetically distinct mutations of a disease. And I would argue, pointer worked, excellent. I would argue that a lung cancer with a mutated BRAF gene, or a lung cancer with a mutated ROS gene, is as distinct from its other siblings within this family of lung cancer as you can possibly get. It might as well be an entirely different disease, because the pathophysiology of the disease is distinct, and because the drugs that we use to treat them are distinct. The targeted therapy we use to attack to attack a BRAF mutation is very different from the targeted therapy we use to attack an ALK-mutated cancer. They're basically different diseases, yet the paradigm of drug development to attack that individual mutation still holds true. And the costs that you incur to develop a drug to attack that mutated BRAF gene or that mutated ALK gene still hold true, and they are absolutely robust. But you have to spread that cost across a relatively small number of patients. To me, this is an orphan disease. This is a rare disease. Perhaps not orphaned in that society recognizes and funds development and treatment of cancer, but when we're talking about an N of 1 or 200 patients with advanced basal cell carcinoma across the country, or we're talking about an N of 1,000 patients with ALK-mutated lung cancer across the country, we're talking about a very rare disease. So, this is my little offering to the party, that not all orphan diseases are, not all rare diseases have typically been labeled orphan in the past. Indeed, the 6,000 orphan diseases identified by the FDA, 80–90% of them are genetic mutations that are handed down familially, and I think that they are going to have to revise their definition of what constitutes an orphan disease in the future. What I would like to say is that new models of research are absolutely needed for the development of these drugs. We need new approaches to getting these drugs not just approved, but paid for. And we need different ways to engage these patients. In particular, when it comes to research, I think in certain cases, a randomized controlled clinical trial is just not feasible. These patients are few and far between. They're spread across the entirety of the geography of Canada. They're not necessarily localized in one big academic center. They're difficult to find. And so large randomized controlled trials are necessarily not easy to pull off. They may also not be desirable to pull off, and we'll talk about what I feel is the injustice of placebo control in a moment. So I think we're going to have to rely on big data. I hate to use that phrase, but big data, large cohorts of patients that are followed longitudinally to figure out what exactly a disease does to patients. We're also going to have to rely on preclinical understanding or phase 1 and phase 2 understanding of how effective a drug is. This is a waterfall plot of a drug we're working on that specifically targets ALK-mutated non-small cell lung cancer. And bars above the line are bad because that's advancement of disease. Bars below the line is good. That actually signals that the disease, the tumor load is regressing and is being impacted on. Show of hands, who here in the room, were they subjected to ALK-positive, ALK-mutated lung cancer? Who here in the room would agree to go on a placebo? It's not funny. Half of our trials in this space don't work because we're asking patients to go on placebo. Nobody in their right mind would say, you know what, new medication for a mutated disease, I'm going to take the old standby. This is death by placebo. This is an absolute injustice to our patients. And it's one that Health Canada, for example, and the FDA are finally getting their heads around. We developed Zelboraf for BRAF-mutated melanoma, and a clear expectation of the FDA was we had placebo control in our trials. And we tracked, there were social media stories about patients randomized to placebo and how poorly they did. But for the flip of a coin, they would have been randomized to a more effective medication. That's a damn shame. Health Canada now accepts phase 2 data. Problem is, our funders will not accept phase 2 non-randomized controlled data. The same experience we had with a drug for advanced basal cell carcinoma, the signal's really clear. There's no way I would accept placebo. This leads to a conversation of how on earth do we actually get our medications paid for? And death by loophole is another inadequacy that I'd like to point out. The regulations right now, the expectations around funding a drug are very clear. If you haven't got a comparison to a randomized controlled or placebo, the data isn't felt to be robust. And in an environment where half of orphan drugs or rare drugs don't make it to Canada and most are turned down by CADTH, the hurdle is even higher for getting these medications approved, because you will have had to have sentenced somebody to an inferior standard of care, placebo, and had them die to justify getting the medication approved. So I think we've got a lot of work to do, a lot of noise to make, and a lot of emotion to stir in order to move this debate in a positive way, move resolution in a positive way, and one of the ways we do that is engagement with the patient community. As I said earlier, and I'm getting the blinking light that I've talked too long, as I said earlier, is these patients are disconnected, spread all across the country. They're not found in big academic centers necessarily, because there aren't any such thing as a rare disease physician. They're being cared for by a variety of specialties. In many cases, these folks don't live long enough to become activists about their diseases. They lack the traction and the resources to make an impact on the political will, and I think this is an area that as an industry we should embrace and actually seek to work closer with. So, I hope I've given you something to think about. I think that orphan diseases are absolutely not relegated to just a few companies. I would argue that most everybody, especially in the area of precision medicine and targeted therapies, most everybody is moving in the direction of rare diseases, and we can't accept that the paradigms of development and funding, regulatory decisions that in the past have worked, will work in the future. Thank you.